What if I told you that the world's greatest mystery writer left behind a story so terrifying it was never published, a manuscript so dangerous it simply vanished? Some say it was fiction, just another case of the great Miss Marple solve. But what if it wasn't? What if this time the mystery was real? Tonight, we uncover the disturbing truth behind Agatha Christie's lost story, Miss Marple's final case, a manuscript that disappeared without a trace, a tale that was never meant to be told, and a mystery that may still haunt us today. This is the case of the unpublished manuscript, Miss Marple's last case, the unsolved mystery of the lost manuscript. Agatha Christie, the undisputed queen of crime, a woman whose mind crafted some of the most perplexing mysteries the world has ever known. Her stories were more than fiction. They were puzzles meticulously woven with secrets, deception, and hidden motives. And yet, despite the hundreds of stories she left behind, there was one that the world was never meant to see. For decades, readers have devoured her novels, unraveling the cunning deductions of Hercule Poirot and the quiet brilliance of Miss Marple, a master storyteller, a genius at misdirection. But behind the fame, behind the millions of copies sold, behind the perfectly plotted whodunits, there was something else, a final story, a case so shocking that it never reached the eyes of the public. And the greatest mystery of all, it was real. A manuscript was said to have existed, a final case for Miss Marple, written in Christie's own hand. But this was not just another country house murder, not another quaint English village, hiding a murderer among its residents. No, this story was different. It was rumored to contain something far more disturbing, a case that, if revealed, might have done more than unsettle its readers. It might have exposed something dangerous. The existence of this manuscript has been whispered about for years. Some believe it was completed, ready for publication before it disappeared without a trace. Others claim it was never finished, abandoned, discarded, locked away by Christie herself. But why? Why would an author, a woman whose life was dedicated to storytelling, suddenly choose to bury a tale so completely? There are those who claim to have seen it, a handful of people who, before their deaths, spoke of a draft locked away among Christie's papers. But each of them carried the same chilling warning, that this was a story that should never be read, that some mysteries are best left unsolved. In the years following her death, countless scholars, collectors, and enthusiasts scoured archives, libraries, and private collections, searching for any trace of the lost manuscript. But the deeper they dug, the stranger things became. Mentions of the manuscript in old documents erased. Records that once acknowledged its existence vanished. And those who claimed to have uncovered its details, their voices, one by one, fell silent. But there was one final clue, a fragment, a letter written by Agatha Christie in the twilight of her life, a letter that referenced a story she had written, a story that haunted her, a story she feared might hold more truth than fiction, and a final line, scrawled in fading ink. Miss Marple should have never uncovered this one. A simple sentence, yet one that raises more questions than it answers. What was in that manuscript? What did Miss Marple uncover that was so terrifying it had to be erased from history? And more importantly, who made sure it was never found? Tonight, we reopen the case. We examine the evidence, trace the whispers, and follow the trail of clues left behind. But be warned, some mysteries refuse to stay buried. And what we find may change the way you see Agatha Christie forever. For years, it was just a rumor, a whisper among literary scholars, a claim that Agatha Christie had written one final case for Miss Marple, a story so compelling, so extraordinary, and then suddenly it was gone. No copies, no records, no notes, only silence. But where do stories go when they vanish? Manuscripts do not simply disappear. They are misplaced, misfiled, buried in archives. Unless, of course, someone wants them to be forgotten. The year was the late 1960s. Agatha Christie was in her twilight years, her hands still crafting stories, her mind still sharp. It was during this time, somewhere between her public appearances and the quiet solitude of her home in Wallingford, that she was said to have written one final case for Miss Marple, a case unlike any before it. But this story was different. The details surrounding its creation are scarce. There was no grand announcement, no press release. It was not submitted to her publisher. Instead, it was whispered that she wrote it in seclusion, away from the watchful eyes of the literary world. A story that she may have never intended to release. A story she locked away. And so we come to the first real clue. The manuscript, where was it kept? For those who knew Agatha Christie well, there was one place where her most private writings were kept. A small, private study tucked away in her home. A room filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk polished from years of use, and a single locked drawer where she kept the manuscripts she wasn't ready to share. It was in that drawer, according to some, that Miss Marple's final case was last seen. Imagine it, a dusty old library, silent except for the faint crackle of an old fireplace, the air thick with the scent of aged paper, ink, and time itself. A single locked drawer, its key hidden in a place only she would know. And inside, bound in a leather binder, lay the last case Miss Marple would ever solve. But when the drawer was finally opened, it was gone. No one knows exactly when it disappeared. No one even knows for certain when it was last seen. But what is known is that in 1975, shortly before her death, Agatha Christie hinted at a final story. A story that had never been published. A story that had never even been spoken of outside her most trusted circle. And then, only months later, she was gone, taking the truth with her. After her passing, her literary estate was meticulously examined. Her personal writings, her letters, her unfinished works, each carefully cataloged and accounted for. But there was no trace of the missing manuscript. No drafts, no outlines, no record that it had ever existed at all. It was as if the story had been erased. But who would erase it? And why? There are those who believe it was simply misplaced, that it is sitting, even now, in some forgotten archive, waiting to be uncovered. But others believe something much stranger happened, that someone, perhaps someone who knew what was in those pages, made sure the manuscript would never be read. And here's where things take a turn. In the years following Christie's death, there were reports, strange accounts from those who went looking for the missing story. Librarians, researchers, collectors, people who spent their lives unearthing literary artifacts. They searched archives, private collections, estate sales, libraries. But whenever they got too close, something happened. Documents that once referenced the manuscript disappeared. Letters where Christie had supposedly written about the story, gone. And those who claimed to have seen it, they either denied it or refused to speak at all. One man, a rare book dealer from London, claimed to have once handled a letter from Christie herself, describing her final Miss Marple story. He never spoke publicly about what was in the letter, but years later, when asked about it, he would only say this: some stories are best left untold. Then, there's the case of a literary scholar who, in the late 1980s, was said to be researching Christie's unpublished works. According to his colleagues, he had found something, a reference, perhaps, to the missing manuscript. He told them he was close, that he was onto something. Days later, he stopped his research completely. He never published a word about it, and when asked why, he simply shook his head and walked away. What was in that manuscript? And more importantly, did someone make sure we would never find out? Miss Marple's final case, if it ever truly existed, has become one of the greatest literary mysteries of all time. A story that was written and then removed. A tale that might still be hidden in an archive somewhere, waiting to be discovered. Or a tale that was deliberately destroyed, erased from existence. And if that's true, the question remains: who took it? And what were they so afraid of? One thing is certain. This mystery is far from over. A missing manuscript. A case that was never solved. A story that, by all accounts, should not exist, and yet whispers of its contents have persisted for decades. Some say it was fiction. Others are not so sure. What was it about this final Miss Marple story that made it different? Why was it never published, never acknowledged, never found? And more importantly, why were those who spoke of it so careful with their words? In the world of Agatha Christie, everything had a purpose. Every clue was deliberate. Every red herring was carefully placed. She wrote with precision, with intent. So if there was a story she chose to keep from the public eye, there had to be a reason. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because unlike her other novels, where the crimes were crafted from imagination, where the victims and suspects were figments of her mind, this one was different. This one, if the whispers are to be believed, was real. According to a leaked summary, Miss Marple's last case was not set in a quiet village or a country estate. It did not involve a vengeful widow or a jealous lover. Instead, it centered around something far more complex and far more dangerous. A crime rooted not in fiction, but in reality. A case that, if published, could have drawn attention to something or someone who did not wish to be seen. The story was said to revolve around a murder, a case that, on the surface, was a simple act of violence, but underneath, it carried implications that reached beyond the pages of the novel. The victim, the suspects, the crime itself, all eerily similar to a real cold case that had remained unsolved since the 1960s. The setting? London. The suspects? Members of an elite circle, men and women whose names held weight in the highest levels of society. People who lived in plain sight, but operated in shadows. And at the center of it all, a truth that, if revealed, could have exposed far more than a simple murder. Could it be that Christie, known for her meticulous research, had stumbled onto something real? Had she written a story that mirrored an actual event? And if so, did she know what she was doing? Or was she playing with fire? Some say the manuscript was a work of pure fiction, that any similarities were nothing more than coincidence. But there are those who believe otherwise. Those who insist that Agatha Christie, whether intentionally or not, had written a story that came too close to the truth, and those who knew about it wanted it gone. The timing is important. The 1960s and 70s were a time of change, of shifting power, of secrets hidden beneath polite society. To write a novel, one that directly or indirectly pointed fingers at real people, wasn't just bold, it was dangerous. But here's where things take a dark turn. Shortly after rumors of this lost story surfaced, something eerie happened. People who had once claimed to know details of the manuscript stopped talking. Those who had referenced it in passing denied its existence altogether, and those who had allegedly read it, one by one, they faded into silence. Take, for example, a former publisher who, in a recorded interview from the early 1980s, mentioned an unpublished Christie story that was never meant to be seen. When pressed for details, he hesitated. He refused to say more. And then months later, when researchers tried to follow up, they found that his records, his entire collection of Christie correspondence, had been destroyed in a fire. Coincidence? Maybe, but there were others. An editor who once spoke of reviewing a Christie draft that was too controversial for print refused to discuss it in later years. A collector who claimed to have seen an early proof of the manuscript would later tell interviewers he had never heard of such a thing. The deeper one looks, the stranger becomes. How can a manuscript, if it ever existed at all, leave behind so many loose ends? How can a story that was never published still manage to unsettle those who once knew of it? Some believe Christie herself destroyed it, that after realizing what she had written, she made the choice to lock it away, to erase its existence. But others believe the decision was not hers to make, that someone else made sure the manuscript would never reach the public. And if that's true, then the real question isn't just what was in those pages. The real question is, who was trying to keep it hidden? Some stories vanish without a trace. Some are forgotten, buried beneath the weight of time. But others leave behind something far more unsettling. A trail of silence, a pattern of unanswered questions, and, in some cases, bodies. For years, the whispers surrounding Miss Marple's final case have remained just that, whispers. A story that was supposedly written, then lost. A mystery that, if real, was erased from history. But lost stories do not erase themselves. Someone always knows something. Someone always sees. And sometimes, those people don't live to tell their tales. Among the first names linked to the missing manuscript was a woman who had stood beside Agatha Christie for years. A woman who had handled her papers, typed her notes, and, some say, read a draft of the final story before it disappeared. Joan Roberts, Christie's personal secretary. Joan was a trusted figure. For over a decade, she worked closely with Christie, transcribing letters, organizing documents, preparing manuscripts for publication. If anyone knew what was written in that final story, it was her. And yet, in the winter of 1976, barely a year after Christie's passing, Joan's life came to an abrupt and tragic end. She was found dead in her home, officially ruled an accident, a fall, nothing more. But the details don't sit right. Friends described Joan as careful and methodical, the kind of person who double-checked every step she took. Yet, according to the report, she tripped on a loose rug and struck her head against the corner of a desk. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, just a fall. A coincidence. That's what they called it. But those who knew her weren't so sure, because in the weeks leading up to her death, Joan had confided in a close friend. She had said something was troubling her, that she had seen something she wasn't supposed to, and then, without warning, she was gone. Joan's death was only the beginning. A year later, in 1977, a literary scholar from Oxford made a bold claim. He had been researching Christie's unpublished works, digging through archives, examining letters and notes, anything that might shed light on the missing manuscript. And then, suddenly, he announced that he had found something, a reference, buried in an old catalog, that suggested the manuscript had once been stored in a private collection. He never revealed what else he knew. He never published his findings, because just weeks after making his discovery, he was found dead. The circumstances? Unusual. He was discovered in his study, slumped over his desk, an open book beside him. No sign of struggle, no indication of foul play, just lifeless. The cause of death? A sudden heart failure. They said, natural causes. But those who saw him last recalled something strange. In the days before his death, he had become withdrawn, distracted. He had mentioned that he was on to something, that his research had taken him somewhere unexpected. And then, suddenly, he stopped speaking about it altogether, almost as if he had been warned. But these are just two names, and the deeper you look, the more you find. A collector in 1981 who claimed to have handled an unpublished Christie draft vanished without a trace. A rare book dealer in 1985 who spoke of a lost story, killed in an unsolved hidden run. A researcher in 1992 who had been tracking the manuscript's movements through private estates, died in his sleep, no medical explanation given. And then there are the stories of those who searched for the manuscript and lived to tell the tale. But what they experienced was something else entirely. Reports began surfacing from libraries, archives, and private collections. Strange occurrences, missing pages from records that should have been intact. Catalogs that once listed the manuscript suddenly altered. Entire files removed without explanation. And those who spent too much time searching, they spoke of something else. Something they couldn't quite explain. One researcher recalled a night spent in a private library, combing through old correspondence. The room had been silent, still, and yet as he read, he became aware of something, movement just beyond his line of sight, a shifting shadow, a faint rustling of pages from a book that no one was touching. Another collector, working alone in a vast, windowless archive, reported hearing the unmistakable sound of a typewriter, keys tapping, one by one. But when he turned, the room was empty. There was no typewriter in sight. Whispers, flickering lights, cold spots in rooms where old manuscripts were stored, pages missing, letters erased. Every step toward the lost story met with resistance, as if something or someone was ensuring that it would never be found. These are only fragments of puzzle, pieces scattered through time, linked by nothing but speculation and unanswered questions. But when too many names vanish, when too many pages disappear, when the path to the truth is littered with silence, you have to wonder, was this just a manuscript? A story lost in the shuffle of history? Or was it something more? Something that someone wanted to disappear permanently? And if that's true, what was in those pages? What was written in the final case of Miss Marple that made it so dangerous, so untouchable that those who even glimpsed it paid the price. Maybe we were never meant to know. A story is never truly lost. Every word, every thought, every page leave a trace. Somewhere, there is always a record, a mention in a letter, a whisper between scholars, a single note in an archive that refuses to be erased. But when it comes to the lost manuscript of Agatha Christie, that trace has all but disappeared. For decades, researchers, collectors, and historians have searched for any sign of its existence. They have combed through private collections, scoured library archives, and followed the coldest of leads. And yet, nothing. No official record. No draft. No title. No mention of it in the carefully preserved documents of Christie's estate. It is as if it was wiped from history entirely. But how does a manuscript vanish without a single remnant left behind? The edges of the story. There are theories, of course. Possibilities that attempt to explain the unexplainable. The first, and perhaps the simplest, is that Agatha Christie herself destroyed it. Some believe that the decision was hers, that she had written something so dangerous, so unsettling, that she made the choice to erase it completely. A final case that was never meant to be solved. A final story that was never meant to be told. There's precedent for this. Christie was known to be meticulous with her work, careful about what she put into the world. She once locked away 2 novels, Sleeping Murder and Curtain, intended to be published only after her death. She was a woman who understood timing, who understood the power of words. And if she wrote something that could not be released in her lifetime, what if, in the end, she decided it should never be released at all? Perhaps it was fear. Fear that what she had uncovered, intentionally or not, would cause more harm than good. That a story, even when disguised as fiction, could reveal too much. That there were truths hidden in her words that could not remain on paper. And so, she made a choice. She took the manuscript, held it in her hands one last time, and watched as it burned. But if that were true, why did she never speak of it? Why was there no record, no note, no quiet confession that she had destroyed something? And why do some insist they saw it long after she was gone? Not all stories are lost. Some are simply buried, locked away where only a select few can find them. Some believe that the manuscript was never destroyed, but instead hidden. Christie's estate has long been guarded. Her works, her notes, her letters, carefully maintained, carefully protected. But there are those who claim that within these archives, there are documents the public has never seen, papers withheld, pages missing from catalogs, entire sections of her writing locked behind closed doors. Could the final manuscript be among them? In 1983, a private Christie collection was discovered in an estate sale. Among the letters and notes was a reference, one that scholars believe might have pointed to the missing story. But before it could be examined, before it could be authenticated, it was purchased, removed, taken by an unknown buyer. And to this day, it has never resurfaced. Who bought it? Where did it go? Did someone know what they were looking for, or were they simply making sure no one else would find it? The idea of hidden works is not new. There are manuscripts in private collections that will never see the light of day, documents stored in secret vaults, owned by individuals who hold them for reasons unknown. What if this is one of them? What if someone, somewhere, holds the last case of Miss Marple locked in a place where only they can read it? And if that's true, then the next question is even more unsettling. There is one more theory, the most chilling of them all, that the manuscript was taken, stolen, removed from history not by accident, but by design. If what was written in those pages was more than fiction, if it was tied to something real, something that certain people did not want exposed, then what would they do to ensure that no one ever read it? Think of the deaths, the quiet silences, the people who knew of the manuscript but never spoke of it again, the reports of missing documents, the voices that once claimed to have seen it, only to later deny that it ever existed. What if this was not coincidence? What if someone was erasing the story, piece by piece, making sure that it was forgotten? Imagine the manuscript, complete and whole, resting in that locked drawer in Christie's study. Imagine someone opening that drawer long after she was gone, Imagine them reading the first few lines, and then realizing that what was written on those pages could never be seen by the public. Imagine them slipping the manuscript into their bag, walking away, and never looking back. Who would have done this? A publisher, afraid of the consequences? A member of Christie's estate, protecting her legacy? Or someone else entirely, someone whose name was never meant to be spoken? The truth is, we may never know. But there is one thing we do know. When a story is simply forgotten, it fades away. But when a story is made to disappear, it leaves behind something else. A shadow, a void, a space where something should have been. And the lost manuscript of Agatha Christie has left behind a void that has never been filled. Some mysteries fade over time. Some are buried beneath the weight of lost records and failing memories, slipping into history like whispers carried away by the wind. And then there are those that refuse to be forgotten, the ones that leave behind something, a fragment, a thread, a single piece of evidence that refuses to be erased. For years, the case of the missing manuscript has been a mystery with no answers, a story that should have been recorded, yet was nowhere to be found. But if the manuscript was truly gone, why does its shadow still linger? Among the scattered traces left behind, there is one clue that has troubled researchers for decades. A letter written by Agatha Christie herself in the final years of her life. A letter in which she spoke of a story that haunted her, a story she could not bring herself to finish. The letter, written in private correspondence, was never meant for the public eye. It was addressed to a close friend, someone within her circle, someone she trusted. And within its careful words, there was a phrase that has puzzled scholars for years. Miss Marple's last case. I don't think I can finish it. What was she afraid of? Agatha Christie was a woman who built her entire legacy on crafting conclusions. She was a master of resolution, the architect of endings that left no questions unanswered. And yet, here she was, unable to complete a story she had already begun. Some say it was simply age, exhaustion, that after a lifetime of writing, perhaps the words no longer came as easily. But others believe it was something else entirely, that whatever she had put onto those pages was something she was afraid to finish, that she had written something too close to the truth, too connected to reality. And that realization left her with a choice: bury the manuscript, or face whatever consequences came with revealing it. But here's where the story takes an even stranger turn. Because if Christie had abandoned the manuscript, then why was it listed in an official archive? In 1977, just 1 year after Christie's passing, an inventory was conducted in a private London library, a collection known for holding rare and unpublished works. A single line stood out among the thousands of entries, a listing under unpublished literary works. It read simply, "Final Manuscript, A. Christie." This entry is the only known record of a missing Christie manuscript. No title, no details, just those few words, hidden within an otherwise ordinary library catalog. But when researchers attempted to track the file, when they requested access, they found that it was missing, gone. No record of where it had been moved. No documentation of who had handled it last. And more disturbingly, when the library's records were re-examined years later, the entry itself was no longer there. It had been erased, as if it had never existed in the first place. Someone removed it, but why? Who had the authority to erase an official inventory record? And more importantly, what were they trying to hide? Was this manuscript truly an unfinished draft, abandoned by its author? Or had it been finished after all? Had Christie completed her final case, only for someone else to ensure that no one would ever read it? Then there's the final question, the one no researcher has ever been able to answer. If this manuscript was never completed, if it was never submitted for publication, then how did it appear in the 1977 catalog? Who placed it there? Who handled it before it vanished? And who was determined to make sure no one would ever find it again? We are left with fragments, a letter that hints at something lost, a library record that no longer exists, a manuscript that should have never been seen, yet was once listed in an archive, and a growing sense that Even decades later, the truth is still out there waiting for someone to find it, waiting for someone to read the words that were never meant to be read, waiting for the case of Miss Marple's final mystery to finally be solved. Some mysteries remain on paper, locked in the pages of history. Others refuse to stay buried. They linger, waiting to be discovered. But what if this one has been watching us all along? For decades, researchers, collectors, and amateur sleuths have searched for answers. They have followed the whispers, traced the missing records, and tried, desperately, to find out what happened to Agatha Christie's lost manuscript. And yet, every path has led to silence. Every clue has faded before it could be fully uncovered. And some who searched too closely have come away with more than just unanswered questions. But then there are the stories, the ones no one can quite explain, the strange occurrences, the unshakable feeling that something is still here, watching, listening, guarding whatever secret was left behind. For years, visitors to Greenway House, Agatha Christie's former home in Devon, have reported seeing something strange. A figure, a presence, an old woman, seated in the corner of the library, hunched over a book as if she were deep in thought. At first, they believe she is part of the museum staff, perhaps an actress or a historian reenacting Christie's life. But when they look again, she is gone. No footsteps, no sound, nothing but the faint scent of aged paper and the lingering awareness that they were not alone. Tour guides have dismissed it as a trick of the light, an illusion cast by the flickering candles and the dust-filled air. But others are not so sure. One visitor, a journalist, described the feeling as being watched, being judged, as if the figure in the library was aware of his presence. He said he'd been walking alone through the house when, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her, a woman sitting in a high-backed chair, the pages of her book turning one by one. But as he stepped closer, the chair was empty, the book untouched. But here's where the story takes an even stranger turn, because multiple visitors, separate people on separate days, have described the same thing, the same moment, the same detail. The woman in the chair, the book in her lap, the presence that lingers in the place where Agatha Christie once sat, where she once wrote, where she may have hidden the last case of Miss Marple, a presence that seems unwilling to leave. And then there's the account of a woman, a self-proclaimed psychic who visited Greenway House in the late 1990s. She claimed she could sense something in the air, a presence, a message left behind. When asked what she meant, she did not hesitate. "She is still here," the woman said. "She is guarding something." The words unsettled those who heard them. What did she mean by guarding? Was it metaphorical? A way of saying that Christie's legacy would never fade? Or was she speaking of something more literal? Something that still remained, hidden beneath the floorboards, behind the walls, tucked away in a forgotten drawer? The woman continued, describing the sensation in the library, a deep, overwhelming sense of unfinished business, a secret that had not yet been revealed, a story that was waiting to be uncovered. When she was asked if she believed the missing manuscript still existed, she gave no answer. Instead, she only smiled and said, "Some stories do not wish to be found." So what are we left with? A manuscript that no one can find, a case that never made it to the public eye, a missing file that appeared briefly before being erased from existence, and a series of strange occurrences that leave us wondering, was this ever just a missing story, or was it something else entirely? Some say the manuscript is still out there, hidden in a vault, waiting for the right hands to open it. Others believe it was destroyed, intentionally, permanently, by someone who knew what it contained. And then there are those who whisper that this was never a mystery meant to be solved, that the story Agatha Christie wrote was never meant to be read. But if that's true, why does it still haunt us? Why do we still search for it? And why, after all these years, do those who look too closely into its disappearance feel as though they are being watched? A lost manuscript, a missing file, a final case that was never meant to be read. For nearly half a century, people have searched for answers. They have scoured libraries, followed every whisper, pursued every lead. And yet, the deeper they dig, the more elusive the truth becomes. Every door that should have led to discovery only leads to silence. Every clue that should have brought clarity vanishes before it can be fully understood. It is as if the story itself does not want to be found. But if that is true, if this was a mystery that was meant to be erased, then why does it still haunt us? Why do we still feel the presence of something unfinished? A question left unanswered, a case left unsolved. Perhaps it is nothing more than a legend, a story that was never written at all, a rumor that gained momentum, fueled by speculation, by curiosity, by the irresistible pull of a mystery without an ending. Maybe the manuscript never existed. Maybe Agatha Christie never completed her final story. Maybe there is nothing to find. Or maybe the manuscript was real. Maybe it was finished. And maybe someone, somewhere, made sure that no one would ever read it. The missing library entry, the people who claim to have seen it, only to later retract their statements. The unexplained deaths, the quiet erasures of any trace that this manuscript ever existed. It is not just the absence of evidence that raises questions. It is the deliberate gaps, the empty spaces where records should be, the pieces that have been removed, as if someone has been carefully rewriting history itself. So, we are left with only one question. The one question that matters most. Did the lost manuscript disappear because it was never written? Or because it was never meant to be found? And now the mystery is yours. What do you believe? Do you think the manuscript still exists, hidden away in a private collection, waiting to be discovered? Or was it destroyed, erased from existence to ensure that no one would ever read what was written in its pages? Was this just a story, an unfinished idea that never made it to publication? Or was it something more, something that came too close to a truth that was never meant to be exposed? Let us know your theory in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this investigation into one of literature's greatest mysteries, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more unsolved cases. But before you go, there is something else. Another mystery. Another story that was never supposed to be told. A book so cursed that those who have read it have never been seen again. What is written in those pages? And why does anyone who dares to open them disappear? Join us next time as we uncover the mystery of the book that should never have existed.